If you were to take a walk in your garden, you'd probably come across a brown garden snail, or maybe even some kind of slug. At first glance, you'd probably think the snail is better off. He's got that shell to protect him after all. I guess that means that slugs were just unlucky in evolution. But that's not true at all, actually. Slugs evolved from an earlier species of snail, and not the other way around. But that doesn't seem to make much sense. Why give up your protection? Well, you might be surprised to learn that throughout history, snails have evolved into slugs more than a dozen separate times, and it's likely still going on now. Long ago, the ancestor of all snails and slugs was a marine snail with a shell. So, counterintuitive as it may seem, losing the shell must obviously have a very clear benefit. But how do we know that? And what proof is there that slugs came from snails? Does this mean that a snail's shell is actually worse off in evolution? Might we one day have no snails at all? Well, let's take a closer look and answer the really big question. Why do snails keep evolving into slugs? So firstly, what's the difference between a snail and a slug? Oh, that's easy. Snails have a shell and slugs don't, right? Almost, not quite. Like a lot of things in nature, it can never be just that simple. So I'll start off by emphasizing that snails are born with their shell, just like we are born with a spine. Removing it is very fatal. On the other hand, a slug will never become a snail by finding a shell, like some kind of slimy hermit crab. They're very happy without one, thank you. And that's because most of them actually already have one, it's just inside of them. Snails have an external shell, and most slugs have an internal shell. It's what's still left behind from their great snail ancestors. You might have heard of vestigial structures. These are the remains of a feature in an organism that have pretty much lost all purpose. A classic example are the hind leg bones found in pythons and boas, or even the pelvic bones that whales and dolphins still have from when they had legs. It's an incredible testament to evolution. We humans actually have some vestigial structures ourselves, like the tailbone and the appendix. Useless now, very useful when we had tails and ate fibrous food. Now in the case of slugs, their internal shell may appear to be vestigial, but it's a bit more of a gray area than that. It plays a role in muscle attachment and acts as a calcium reserve, which is really important for their bodily processes. There's also evidence that it acts as a form of structural support, very much like our spine. Now let's get to the big question. What about protection? Well, is protection all that useful when it makes you a lot easier to find? In France, snails are eaten and slugs aren't, and that's partly because a shell is just so much easier to handle. It's like they come in prepackaged containers. How convenient. Obviously, slugs didn't evolve in response to the French, but it goes to show that shells aren't always helpful. Now before we take a look at how predation may have influenced land slugs in losing their shells, let's take a look at sea slugs. The ocean is full of powerful beaks, jaws, and claws, all too eager to eat up a little sea slug. A shell is hardly an obstacle for a sea turtle or an octopus, both with powerful crushing beaks and an expertise in finding hiding prey. So what do? You hide in plain sight. By developing a vivid bodily coloration and a powerful concoction of toxins to match, you can effectively hide in the colorful reefs. At the same time, predators that do find you get a powerful message. Eat me if you dare, you won't live to regret it. This is called aposematic coloration, and it's quite common in the ocean. Down here, colors definitely aren't just for show. Land slugs aren't anywhere close to as colorful, and that makes sense. They need to blend in with the soil, which is pretty uniformly brown. And unlike sea slugs, land slugs don't have toxins. Predators won't have any trouble eating them. For a sea slug that wants to show off its bright colors, it makes sense not to have a shell hiding their message. Or at least it kind of does, because their shell could have evolved to become colorful as well. But that doesn't explain land slugs, and there are plenty of sea slugs that aren't colorful too. So clearly, there must be more to the story than just predation. And of course, there is. For both sea and land snails, a shell takes a lot of calcium to maintain. It also adds a lot of bulk and reduces their mobility. So, if at some point throughout history there were a snail born with a smaller shell than the rest, he'd have an easier time maintaining energy and supplying his body with the calcium it needs. He survives and passes off his small shell to his offspring, which also have small shells, until eventually one of them creates a snail that has an even smaller shell, and he has an even easier time surviving. That process keeps going and going and going until eventually you have a snail which is no longer a snail because there's no external shell. It's now a slug. Of course, that's highly simplified, but you get the idea. We can see this happening in some snails today, which are sometimes called semi-slugs. They have a shell which they can't retract into because it's become too small. But if having no shell was such a large benefit for slugs, then why do we still have snails at all? Well, hold on. I never said that the shell was useless. In fact, there are some major benefits, like not drying out in the sun. Because a snail's shell holds moisture, they can thrive in areas where slugs might struggle. If a slug doesn't stay moist, it can desiccate or dry out. A shell is also, of course, great protection against smaller predators which can get into the slug's hidey holes, like a centipede. But that same protective shell needs a lot of calcium, and that's fine if you have an abundance of calcium in the area, but it's a really big problem if you don't. Speaking of calcium, reptiles and birds need a lot of it too. Many parrot owners will actually give their birds cuttlefish bone as a supplement for it. On the other hand, reptile keepers will sprinkle their animals' food with a calcium dust. A snail's shell is a great source of calcium, and many predators will target them for that. Like the caiman lizards of South America. Snails make up a really big portion of their diet, but they'll happily take slugs too if they can get to them. But as slugs don't have shells, they can fit into tight crevices that snails just can't. There's something interesting that happens in developing snails which may have also pushed slugs away from shells, and that is a process called torsion. As you can see in this incredible scientific illustration, torsion is the 180-degree rotation of the visceral mass, or the organs, that happens inside of a snail during their embryonic development. It brings the respiratory organs and the anus to the front of the animal, which optimizes space and makes movement easier within the confines of a shell. It also makes it easier for the snail to retract into that same shell. Now, slugs and sea slugs go through detorsion, which is the reversal of torsion during their larval phase, and this makes them bilaterally symmetrical. By being bilaterally symmetrical, slugs are more streamlined, have easier mobility, and can move relatively faster. And of course, being detorted and having no shell, they're a lot more maneuverable and flexible than snails or other mollusks. Without being confined to a shell and having more mobility, a slug can reach resources that a snail may struggle to, so of course there's less competition between the two creatures. But what's the major takeaway? Is having a shell inferior or superior? Well, the answer is neither. A shell is either useful or not, depending on the environment and niche that you're trying to take up. For ancient snails that struggled to find calcium or that lived in moist environments, it made sense to ditch the shell, especially if tight crevices proved more useful than your shell for protection. On the other hand, if you lived in a dry environment with a lot of calcium, then you could support a stronger, bigger shell which predators struggle to get into. You'd also have the added benefit of having more protection from the sun. And so, having a shell, or not, is neither inherently bad nor good. It's just better adapted to some lifestyles and environments than others. And so, dozens of times throughout history, both on land and in the ocean, snails found themselves in situations where a smaller and smaller shell proved to be beneficial. And so they adapted and became slugs without an external shell. And that is why snails keep evolving into slugs. I'd like to ask you a favor. If you enjoyed, then please click like and let me know. You'll also be helping me to spread the video. Thank you for watching.